distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 2020 Seoul International Forum on Elections, hosted by the National Election Commission of the Republic of Korea, here at our office in Gwacheon. My name is Luke Butcher, and I'm from the Administration and International Affairs Division of the NEC. I will be your MC for today. For those in the audience, the room has undergone disinfection, and all participants are asked to wear their masks and maintain social distancing throughout the event. This forum is an annual gathering of election experts and officials from around the world. Originally, it was scheduled to be held with the International Election Observation Program for the 21st National Assembly elections in April. But due to the global COVID-19 pandemic, the NEC decided to cancel the observation and suspend the forum. Now, for the first time, we are hosting this forum both in person and online, and we welcome everybody that is watching around the world. Today, we will have two sessions focused on issues important to election management under the theme of overcoming the pandemic toward democracy. Before we begin with the presentations, we have three esteemed speakers with us here today to open our forum. Firstly, Standing Commissioner of the NEC, Mr. Jo Hae-ju, will open the forum. Standing Commissioner Jo held a number of senior positions at the NEC during a career that spanned from 1992 to 2013, including Chief Election Officer and Standing Commissioner of the Gyeonggi Provincial Election Commission. He was appointed in January 2019 as the Standing Commissioner at the NEC. Please welcome him to the stage.
Distinguished representatives of election management bodies and international organizations, and distinguished guests including eminent scholars. I'd like to announce the opening of 2020 Seoul International Forum on Elections, SIFE. First, I'd like to extend my gratitude to Swedish Ambassador Jakob Hallgren to the Republic of Korea and Secretary General Choi Jong-hyun of AWEB, who are going to deliver congratulatory remarks. On behalf of the NEC of Korea, I also welcome panelists joining through video and domestic experts present here and other participants joining online. This is the 6th Seoul International Forum on Elections. Due to the pandemic, we are using the form of video conference. Although we cannot see international participants in person, it is very meaningful to adopt the new way of non-contact forum. The COVID-19 pandemic has changed many things of our life, and people are now discussing how to prepare for the post-COVID-19 era. Elections that are at the heart of democracy are no exception. Under this crisis, many countries deferred or suspended elections, and those countries with upcoming elections have great challenge of finishing elections without significant issues amid COVID-19. In the preparation for the 21st National Assembly elections in April in Korea, the NEC developed and implemented the measures to ensure safe voting environment and suffrage. We successfully finished the elections without any confirmed cases and with high turnout. After the elections, many countries requested the NEC to share our election management experience. Through a number of web seminars, we could see many countries are making effort to overcome the limitations of COVID-19 to realize representative democracy and safety of their citizens at the same time. To reflect such international issues, the theme of the forum is Overcoming the Pandemic Towards Democracy. The topic of Session 1 is special voting in different countries, broadening geographical limits. I expect active discussions on various voting methods to protect the voters' rights. The topic of Session 2 is election management overcoming COVID-19 in Korea. Korea is going to share its experience of successfully managing the National Assembly elections amid the pandemic. And I hope various measures would be suggested to overcome the common crisis of the international society. In conclusion, I'd like to thank the presenters and the audience once again who are participating despite their busy schedule. The discussions made in 2020 SIFE would greatly contribute to improvement of election systems and advancement of democracy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And our next speaker offering congratulatory remarks is Jakob Hallgren, Swedish Ambassador to the Republic of Korea. Ambassador Hallgren served as Deputy Director of the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute from 2012 to 2018. He previously worked at the Swedish Ministry of Foreign Affairs as head of its humanitarian division and as head of its division for conflict issues. Please welcome him to the stage.
Dear Mr. Che Haiju, Standing Commissioner of the National Election Commission, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it's really my great honor to be here today and to share some thoughts from the Swedish perspective on this topical forum on the theme of overcoming pandemic toward democracy. And I would really like to extend my sincere gratitude to the National Election Commission of Korea for inviting me to this very meaningful and important event. Let me also start by where you were just talking, Mr. Standing Commissioner, about congratulating your country for the really spectacularly successful conduct of the National Assembly elections on the 15th of April this year. So despite the challenges posed by the ongoing pandemic, you managed to implement a number of precautionary measures that led to a safe voting procedure and a record high voter turnout as well, which was quite extraordinary to see at close range since I was in the country at the time. And the South Korean election to the National Assembly was actually the first major election that happened after the pandemic broke out in the spring, and therefore your experience came to be of high value for many other countries who have since then held or are still planning election. I can say that this was particularly highlighted by International IDEA, which is based in Stockholm, and we held a successful webinar in June discussing this and comparing country experiences. Now today we're here to talk about democracy and how democracy can be maintained and strengthened even during pandemic times. And to me, as a Swede, democracy really means to think, being able to think, to speak, and to love whomever you want. Democracy is what enables you to make your voices heard, and it gives you the right to influence and to demand accountability. I think that democracy provides hope and the condition to shape a common future in a safe and peaceful society, and it also makes us equal before the law and safeguards our equal values as human beings. So everyone, man and woman, must have equal rights and opportunities as equal gender societies and democracy strengthen each other in our view and my view. I think democracy gives room for different voices to be heard and respected, and it allows engagement and scrutiny of power, which is, I think, extremely important. But this democracy should, of course, never be taken for granted. You need to fight to achieve this every day, to protect it, and I think that this challenge is becoming even more of a struggle during the COVID-19 pandemic, as it really threatens to accelerate the global trends of what is unfortunately a democratic backsliding and weakening also of the respect of human rights, which we see in many countries. This pandemic is placing enormous pressure on the ability for many democratic institutions to function, and it might have serious consequences for human rights. We all know that it's a fact that around the world authoritarian leaders are gaining ground, democratic principles are under threat, and the respect for the right to freedom of expression, assembly and association is in decline. All the research shows this. We see that democratic institutions are weakened and the democratic space is shrinking. So today democracy and the principles need to be actively protected, which is why I very much salute this conference. So since the COVID-19 pandemic respects no borders, it needs to be addressed with joint international efforts. So this is not really the time for any protectionism, nationalism, or isolation, but rather a time for isolation and cooperation. So I believe that in our global response, we need to promote a strong multilateral system and a rules-based world order. And our responses to the pandemic must not come at the cost of weaker democracies or more human rights violations. On the contrary, for me, from Sweden, we believe that an approach based on democracy, gender equality and human rights is really key to fighting this COVID-19 pandemic situation. So what is then needed in order to ensure that democracy is protected and can even be further strengthened during these times? How can the public's trust in democracy and democratic institutions be reinforced? Well, I believe that the most important thing in this rapidly changing reality is to ensure transparency. Transparency and access to reliable information. Freedom of expression and free and independent media are key factors, as well as the need to counter disinformation, fake news, and I think that journalists and others who warn about the risks are crucial in this regard, and they should never be silenced. The voices of independent media and civil society, including human rights defenders, must, I believe, be protected and even promoted, and their monitoring and reporting will contribute to hold governments accountable. Now, there's been a lot of talk about emergency powers during pandemic, and they are indeed allowed by international law in response to significant threats. And there are indeed circumstances where some human rights may be restricted. However, any such emergency responses and restrictions must, of course, be strictly in line with international law and not be used as an excuse to violate any of those human rights or even to shrink the democratic space. And I think they need to be limited in time as well. So there must be accountability for any human rights violations or abuses committed during this crisis, or for any undermining of democratic principles or the rule of law. And I think we are all experts and believers in this, but we need to remain vigilant and to ensure that the international standards and principles do not slip. Now, we spoke about this before, but the Swedish response to the COVID-19 pandemic has indeed received a lot of attention in international media. And I just like to emphasize that the Swedish response really shares the same goals as all other countries, which is to save lives and protect public health, even though there has been failures and mistakes in our response and in many others. So our response to counter the pandemic consists of both recommendations and legally binding measures, but we have not enforced full lockdowns in Sweden, just like in Korea, by the way. So this use of recommendations in public health efforts is actually quite a common strategy in Sweden, and these recommendations are usually followed to a very high degree. And according to this World Values Survey, there is an unusually high level of public trust in the Swedish society, which I, by the way, think is the same in Korea in many ways. So Swedish institution the Swedish population trust their public institutions and believe that they will act in the public interest. And for their part, the authorities actually also trust the citizens to heed their advice. So applied to the current situation, that means that there is a high level of adherence to recommendations. And since this outbreak, there has also been a consistently strong public support in Sweden for the measures taken by the Public Health Agency, and a broad majority of the Swedish population say that they trust the government's handling overall of the pandemic to a large or quite a large extent. Moreover, and this is another very important dimension, Sweden actually have an officially declared feminist foreign government and foreign policy, and this means that we are also consistently working strongly with the gender perspective in our global response, both in the short and the long term. And we believe that this is absolutely crucial in building back better, because it is important to be mindful about how both women and men are impacted differently by the COVID-19 outbreak, and to integrate that gender equality aspect in all of our actions. And when you look at it, you will realize that this is actually quite an important aspect. Now, another very important area for the Swedish government is the so-called Drive for Democracy, which is actually a public government policy initiative, and that aims to strengthen the respect for democratic principles and institutions, civil society, and international law. The background to this Drive for Democracy is what I talked about at the beginning, a growing concern about the threats and the challenges that democracy is facing in the world today. And then translating this Drive for Democracy into today's current context mean that we must ensure that the actions to combat COVID-19 do not undermine or compromise democracy. Because I believe that in the aftermath of all this, after the pandemic, we will all face, in all our countries and democracy, a discussion of which form of government dealt actually with the outbreak most efficiently. And I believe that in this discussion, it is important that we take ownership of the narrative and argue for the rightness of a democratic, human rights-based approach to countering the pandemic. And we also need to keep the wider public health notion in mind as inclusive measures, or rather intrusive measures, to restrain the pandemic risk threaten both people's rights and their health. So we in Sweden, we rest convinced that democracy is really the best foundation for a sustainable society. Research actually shows that a democratic, inclusive, and equal society provides opportunities for all to achieve their full potential and participate in the development of a society in a way that other systems of government cannot do. In a strong democracy, equality, and everyone's enjoyment of human rights tend to be strong, and the weak in these society to be protected, and the opposite is absolutely true in non-democratic societies or in societies with weak democracy. So we believe that a strong democracy creates stability and security, growth and economic prosperity. And we, as Sweden, will continue to do all that we can to be a strong voice in this respect and an actor for democratic development around the world. I'm sorry for being so long, but thank you so much for this opportunity, and I really wish you good luck for this afternoon session. Thank you so much. Kamsahamnida.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Our final congratulatory remarks are from former Ambassador and current Secretary General of the Association of World Election Bodies, Choi Jong-hyun. Secretary Chair had a distinguished 32-year career at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, including a year as Ambassador to the Sultanate of Oman and 3 years as Ambassador to the Kingdom of the Netherlands. He was appointed as Secretary General of AWEB at the 4th General Assembly in India last year. Please welcome him to the stage.
Mr. Cho Hae-ju, Standing Commissioner of the National Election Commission of the Republic of Korea, His Excellency Jacob Holmgren, Ambassador of the Kingdom of Sweden to the Republic of Korea, and distinguished speakers. Let me begin by expressing my deep appreciation to the National Election Commission of the Republic of Korea for this kind invitation to attend the 2020 Seoul International Forum on Elections. And this year is the 6th one, and I'm very much looking forward to it proving to be another resounding success. My sincere thanks go also to our outstanding speakers today, who will share their valuable insights. I trust that the entire audience will very much benefit from their presentations. Distinguished participants, the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic are being felt all around the world, causing a lot of distress to all of us. And this unprecedented crisis has impacted the field of elections as well. Many elections have been postponed or even cancelled all around the world. So it is due to the outbreak and spread of COVID-19, so it is quite natural and logical that overcoming the pandemic toward democracy has been selected as a topic for this year's forum. In the midst of the COVID-19, so it is imperative that election management bodies, EMBs, identify the common challenges and seek solutions together. And indeed, many international conferences and web seminars have already been held. I believe that this forum will contribute greatly to our common efforts to overcome the challenges resulting from the pandemic. I trust the presentations will provide an invaluable frame of reference for election management bodies and other stakeholders in their important work of election management. For election management bodies, EMBs, to come and work together in order to share experience and expertise in the hope that together we can identify best practices, we need a forum. And AWEB, Association of World Election Bodies, which I represent here today, has a great potential. It serves as an effective forum, in particular in that it is universal body. It has, for now, 117 member EMBs from 107 countries. And I take this opportunity to say that the active participation in the activities of AWEB by EMBs and other international organizations and many stakeholders in election management would be most deeply appreciated. On a final note, I hope that all of you and your family members will stay safe in these difficult times. And thank you very much for your kind invitation and attention again. And I wish you all the best. And once again, It's my sincere hope that this forum will be another great success. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Secretary General. We will now take a short 2-minute break as we set up the stage for our first session. So please bear with us one moment. Thank you very much. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. We will now be starting our first session entitled Special Voting in Different Countries, Broadening Geographical Limits. We will focus on different forms of special voting from around the world put in place by election management bodies to help ensure everybody is allowed to vote, and the pandemic has increased the need to look into the ways of voting outside the traditional polling station on election day. We have 3 presentations, and then we will take questions from the audience at the end. We'll be opening our YouTube comment section at the end if people would like to make a comment there. For those, and our first speaker is going to be Professor Robert Krimmer from the University of Tartu in Estonia. He is one of the world's leading experts on digital governments and electronic forms of democracy, and was the first senior advisor to the OSCE ODIHR on new voting technologies. He has also advised for a number of other international organizations, including UNESCO, UNDP, the WHO, the European Commission, and finally AWEB. He joins us live now from Estonia. Good morning, Professor.
Good morning. Hello, welcome. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, can you hear us clearly from Estonia?
Oh, very well. Thanks to the internet. It is, while it is not possible to be there in person, it's still a great way of participating.
Yeah, and thank you for waking up so early this morning. I know it's very early your time.
Yeah, it works.
So please feel free to take it away.
Okay, thank you so much, dear audience. Obviously, COVID has put us all under pressure, but even more so elections. And what I would like to talk to you about is one particular experience, one particular instrument of convenience voting, meaning making it easier for voters to participate in two dimensions. On the one hand side, in the dimension of location, wherever they are, and on the other hand, in time, whenever they want to participate in the election. But before I go into more detail on how my host country, Estonia, being Austrian, has actually achieved this and developed this, I would like to give you a bit of context about where is Estonia, because probably not everyone knows about those key facts about the country. So Estonia is a small country. It's about the size of the Netherlands or Switzerland, and it's located, you could say, probably 1,000 kilometers south of where Santa is supposedly home, or more easily in Western terms, about 100 kilometers south of Helsinki, the capital of Finland. So it borders Russia, which is an important neighbor, obviously, and a former occupant, of the Soviet Union. It has about 1.3 million inhabitants, which is only about 1/10 of the Netherlands, or about 1/6 of Switzerland. So it's actually not that densely populated. And it actually had to fight with a decrease in population over time. So actually reaching a polling station in Estonia is actually not that easy sometimes. And that also is one of the factors to consider. Still, living in Estonia is actually fantastic in the summer, right? So we have really sun all day long. However, in winter, when elections usually take place, you should probably replace that picture with basically a black picture. So people in Estonia actually like to work from home, like to learn from home. So it's not surprising that already since the late 90s, with the Tiger Leap initiative, they have started to equip all schools, all government organizations with internet connections. They have actually put a focus on educating their children already very early on in kindergartens with little robots. And so they cover the whole country with broadband internet. So fiber connections, like in South Korea, are a given. And so 75% of the homes have broadband. Not all of them fiber, obviously. So some of them really, because of the rural nature, have to rely on mobile LTE-based internet. But still, there's a very liberal approach to internet access. So some things like fair use or limitations in ports or other things, they're completely unknown in Estonia. So internet access is actually considered a human right. It is not enshrined in law, but it's considered a social right of everyone that they should have access to the internet. Similarly, with this digital mindset of the people actually thinking digital, zeros and ones being totally natural to them, it's actually no surprise that bank transfers are done completely electronically. And if you know the European banking system, actually also surprisingly, all the bank payments take place instantaneously, right? So in the past in Europe, it always took like 3-4 days for bank transfer to go through. In Estonia, this is not the case. Similarly, income tax declarations, which are mandatory in Estonia, are done electronically also over the internet. The residents of Estonia have about 45 days to do so. Although they have quite some days to do it, 25% of them did it last year within the first 24 hours, right? So really, they're really diligent of doing so. You wouldn't do that even if it wouldn't be easy to use. So it's pre-filled using the once only principle. But obviously also there is a monetary incentive. They get, when you file your taxes online, you get your money within 2 weeks. If you file it on paper, you get it within 5 months. So it's a no-brainer, yeah? And this digital mindset really is marked by one particular important figure. So in the last elections that took place, which were the elections to the European Parliament, 47% of the votes were cast using the online channel, meaning almost every second vote. With this digital mindset, what could even almost imagine even in Estonia. So, and even rebranding the country as e-Estonia is actually something that is very common in international media. This branding a nation even goes so far that the prime minister promotes this electronic channels, including the internet voting. And the former prime minister, Taavi Rõivas, even recorded a video that you can watch on YouTube still today when you want to see how does it actually work. So why is it that Estonia has managed to be such a front runner with internet voting? It's even such a front runner that it's the only country to date that has introduced internet voting without any preconditions, without any limitations, and for all elections for all the people that live in its country. So still, the question is, how did they manage? Essentially, the starting point is something which is also going to happen in a week's time in the United States elections, just 20 years ago. So the elections in 2000 between Gore and Bush were actually the starting point for the debates around internet voting. Up until that time, the United States was basically destined to introduce for the first time internet voting. Bill Clinton, the president in the late, at the end of the last millennium, actually even tasked the National Foundation elaborate or to discuss whether internet voting could be introduced for presidential elections in the United States. And they actually came to the conclusion after the Florida 2000 disaster, you know, with those butterfly ballots and hanging chads and all those bad images that we had in our mind that hopefully will not return next week, that the US is not ready with its complex and complicated electoral system and an electoral management system. And so the Estonians said, you know, if the US can't do that, which are great in helping us protect our country, we need to show them how you do elections, right? So they just started discussing in about a year later in the early 2001, 2002, how could they actually introduce internet voting? It fit the narrative of a young country, of being different, of doing things differently. So they also had some legal debate. It was not given that the country would go forward with this. They had a constitutional review. They had a test pilot in Tallinn, which is the capital of Estonia, where they were talking about where to establish. Okay, that's a bit much for Tallinn, but still, if you know how small the city is, but still, they did a test. And they actually concluded this testing with the first legally binding internet vote in October of 2005. That was also the first time that I visited the country, and I was impressed with the way that the country has set up that elections. But I was actually very much disappointed, and I will show you in a bit, with the number of people participating. It was only 2% of the cast votes, about 10,000 voters. But only when I understood really what it meant, together with the internet voting, they had introduced a smart card for every resident in the country. And that smart card included a chip that you needed to learn how to use it. And out of those 10,000 voters, 7,000 were first-time users of that smart card. So actually, internet voting became a driver for the national identification infrastructure in the country. And it really pushed that forward, and you will see later how successful that was. Second, between 2005 and 2011, that was actually the growth phase of internet voting. And they developed the system further, and they actually realized that there are some shortcomings, which also concluded in the 2011 OECD report that I was involved in, where we actually recommended to introduce verifiability to the process. Verifiability is a way that you actually can verify whatever has happened in between your setting up your decision in your mind and actually entering it into the computer and submitting it to the servers, that what you had in mind actually ended up in the ballot box and was counted in the right way. And so we proposed that in particular to counter discussions around hacking, around manipulation, so that actually the individual voter had a chance to verify how he or she has voted and how it has been recorded. So that is a particular feature that none of the other convenience channels can actually offer. If you think about postal voting, this heavily debated voting channel in many elections, you know, basically once you have mailed your ballot, there is no control of how it has been counted, if it ever reached, and so on and so on. In particular, if you live abroad, that is a big concern, including in my own home country, where I had several occasions where I was not able to cast my ballot because the material just ended up too late in my own mailbox. So the country really has this joint effort of updating and of discussing their internet voting system. And that led to this continuous acceptance of the internet voting tool. So it has been in use for almost 15 years. So it started out with about 2% in 2005. It reached 1/3 in the 2014 to 2017 elections. So it was relatively stable then. And then it got a huge push again last year with the national and the European Parliament elections, with now almost every second voter casting their vote online. So internet voting is not undebated. I don't want to say that. It actually is also quite debated with one of the government parties that feels a bit disenfranchised with the channel. But overall, I would say compared to other countries, there is quite a broad support for this technology. Let me show you how easy it works, or what you have to do in order to cast a ballot in the Estonian elections. First, you go to the website of the Estonian Electoral Committee, you download the software, so it doesn't run in the browser, it's a separate software. Then you have to enter a first PIN of your smart card, which you use to identify yourself. After that, you get shown a ballot sheet. Here you see actually the ballot sheet, what is your favorite menu? Yeah, so this was a test election. And so you could select the different options. Actually, also note that in Estonia, people vote using numbers. So when you vote on paper, you actually write down the number of the candidate, and you don't tick a box like in other Australian ballot style electoral systems. And so in the internet voting system, for the only one, you actually have a list of candidates that you can select. After you've selected, you get asked, do you really want to cast a ballot? And then you have to confirm it with your digital signature, with which you would make a legally binding act. You could buy a car, for example, and you would have to pay for it. So you enter a 5-digit PIN to confirm your vote. After that, in the newest election, you get shown a QR code with which you can use your mobile phone to actually verify if your vote was actually cast correctly. The overall technical system is following the postal ballot scheme, so that you actually encrypt your vote with the public key of the electoral committee. You outer end of the picture, you submit both together to the ballot box, yeah, and then during the counting, the electoral committee, who you trust, obviously, otherwise you probably wouldn't participate in the election, they separated in the identified ballots or the identified envelopes, and then the unidentified encrypted votes, and start to shuffle them, like shuffling the ballot box as you know it from paper, and then they apply the private key to decode the results. The private key is shared amongst 7 members of the electoral committee, and only when they come together and jointly reestablish the private key can you actually count the vote. So important, as I mentioned before, is really this end-to-end verifiability, that you can verify according to a chain of custody. Very similarly to when you have your paper ballots, and those paper ballots get counted by a scanner, you can always count again those paper ballots, right? So you want to verify that actually the vote was cast as intended. So what you had in your mind was actually put on the ballot sheet. Then you want to verify if that ballot sheet actually entered the ballot box in the right way and was not changed in between. And then last but not least, you want to make sure that your votes in that ballot box get recorded in the correct way. And that is the so-called individual and universal verifiability. But of course, you might also ask yourself, I mean, why actually do such an endeavor if you already have elections, you already have polling stations? And so here we actually did with my research group a study on the cost of democratic elections. We did that over the last 4 years. We actually used 3 comparative case studies. We used process modeling as a technique where we actually depicted all the process steps in the electoral process. And using that, we actually assigned costs to do them in order to actually calculate the activity-based costing. So we actually were able to determine how much does one electronic vote or internet vote cost, which is around €2. So the numbers we have refined over time also a bit further. Actually, compared to election day voting is almost half the cost when you vote in the polling station. But what's really expensive is the voting in advance of the election day, where you actually have a lot of staff to man, but not many voters if you consider the whole period. So in Estonia, you can vote during 10 days before election day also. So let me summarize. Internet voting certainly is the most complicated form of electronic democracy. The Estonian model has attracted a lot of attention. It also means that there is a lot of responsibility on the small country to maintain and to update that process up to the standards and of what the community and what the scientific community has actually also come out and needs to continuously update the software and the technology. But it takes time to build the infrastructure, the capacity, and the trust into the electoral system. So what matters is actually the context, that you have a stable political and administrative system which has the capacity and the legal culture to introduce a new channel while actually bearing in mind what has been done in the past and what is supposedly to be done in the future. So doing rush decisions just within 3 months to introduce internet voting, like it has happened in the neighboring country of Lithuania, which in the end did not use the internet voting system because there was just not enough time. You need to have enough time to actually introduce it and need to discuss it to get a broad consensus in your country so that it's actually in line with your governance traditions. So having convenience voting, having internet as one option is certainly possible, but it's not something that's out of nowhere, but needs a lot of work and a lot of time, and it needs to have the right context in place. With that, I thank you very much for your attention, and thanks for inviting me. Sorry I couldn't be there in Seoul in person this time, but I'm sure it will work out in the near future, and I'm looking forward to your questions after the end of this session and this tremendous speeches by my dear colleagues, Toby and Antonio. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. I think there's a round of applause from here in Seoul. And now we'll move on to our second presentation. So, Professor, if you hold on for the Q&A session at the end. We will now move on to presentation by Toby James, Professor of Politics and Public Policy at the University of East Anglia. He has held positions at a number of universities, as well as at International IDEA and the John W. Kluge Center in the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. He is also currently Editor-in-Chief of the journal Policy Studies and Senior Fellow to the UK All-Party Parliamentary Group on Democratic Participation. Toby's research focuses on the administration and management of the electoral processes, and he was co-founder and co-convener of the Electoral Management Research Network, which brings together leading scholars on election management. So good morning, Professor. I know you are also in the UK today. Can you
Good morning. Good morning, Luke, and good morning, everyone. It's great to be able to join you this morning.
Excellent. Thank you. Another person that's woke up very early to be part of the forum today, and we're very, very grateful.
Okay.
You can take the presentation away.
Well, thank you again very much for the kind invitation. It's a great honor to be able to speak to you this morning from Norwich here in the United Kingdom. So one of the great wonders of democracy, which was introduced in one of the earlier talks, is the importance of equality. Democracy is, in many respects, the great leveler. There might be many underlying inequalities in any given society, whether they are economic inequalities or whether they are educational inequalities, but we're all equal before the ballot box. The idea of one person, one vote ensures that each vote that is cast has equal value. Of course, in practice, there are some barriers to that in any kind of given particular system. But some of these barriers do tend to be practical barriers for participation. Barriers, particularly, for example, for citizens that have underlying health disabilities or mental disabilities. For example, as we're showing on the slide here, these might be mobility issues. Some people might find it very difficult for them to access a polling station. Some people might find it very difficult for them to travel on the day of the election. Perhaps they may suddenly become very ill. There are also potentially childcare issues. Some citizens have obviously children for whom they are responsible and will have caring duties, which may make it more difficult in practice for them to be able to cast their vote. And likewise, perhaps there are other caring duties that citizens might have, for example, for other elderly members of their family. So, although in theory, democracy is a great lever, there actually is a need for proactive action in order for democracy and democratic ideals to be realized. Many international standards actually include measures and requirements for accessibility to be realized as part of the voting process. And even where those requirements are not there, set out in the letter of the requirements, I would argue that in many senses, there are still those requirements for electoral management bodies and government actors to make proactive steps to make it easy for people to vote. For example, International IDEA in their handbook on international electoral standards guidelines sets out that the legal framework should ensure that all eligible citizens are guaranteed the right to universal and equal suffrage, as well as the right to compete in elections without any discrimination. So if we were to take no action and provide no additional mechanisms for citizens, then there is arguably this possibility that there may be an underlying discrimination for citizens that find it much more difficult to cast their ballots. And in recent work with a colleague, Holly Ann Garnett, we introduced this idea of inclusive voting mechanisms. And inclusive voting mechanisms are policy instruments which can reduce turnout inequality between groups and mitigate other inequalities within the electoral process. So with respect to some of those examples that we've given already, perhaps people have mobility issues, then it obviously makes sense to ensure that there are physical ramps within polling stations to make sure that if a citizen is using a wheelchair, they can obviously cast their ballot at ease and are not put off by the process. Other examples might include braille ballot papers or proxy voting, postal voting, and also obviously, of course, perhaps as Robert was talking about earlier in the presentation there, internet voting may help to realize these goals as well. Importantly, I think country contexts make a difference. The nature of those inequalities makes a difference, and there probably isn't a one size fits all to these issues. But the COVID-19 pandemic has brought these questions very sharply to the forefront and presented unprecedented challenges in terms of delivering accessibility at the ballot box. The virus obviously has led to severe illness of many people around the world on or around their election day. At the latest count, according to the Johns Hopkins University website, there are 43 million cases worldwide and confirmed, and those cases are obviously rising fast. And this means that millions more have also had caring responsibilities for friends or family, or who themselves have been quarantined on their election day, making it obviously very difficult for them to vote. Now, what's particularly troubling about this, obviously, is that there is a propensity for the virus to fall very unevenly across the populations. We know from the scientific research that this is more of a threat for citizens with underlying health conditions, whether this is lung or heart disease, diabetes, or conditions that might affect their immune system. And there's also an age aspect to this as well. It's thought to be more likely to affect citizens that are over 60 and have more severe consequences for them. And this means that voters could be deterred. A voter with COVID-19 could be deterred, their family members could be deterred, other citizens could be deterred from casting their ballots. And of course, there's also the risk here that the election itself could be an opportunity for the transmission of the disease. So what can be done about this? So I'm currently involved in a project here at the University of East Anglia with colleagues at the University of Newcastle. We're collaborating with International IDEA to ask the questions about what effect COVID has had on elections, and then crucially, what mitigating actions have countries put in place and how effective have these actions been. And you can view the websites in your own time at electoralmanagement.com, where we've got a range of case studies that you can look at in detail to see what measures have been put forward, as well as some sets of comparative analysis. And so I'm going to draw from some of that now in the next few slides. It's worth saying to begin with, there are many countries where, according to the research that we've done, it seems that there are certainly significant challenges for citizens in terms of being able to cast their vote on election day if they have COVID-19 themselves. So there are cases where citizens would be prohibited under law from actually exercising their democratic right to vote. Recently, Belize's Prime Minister has insisted that people with COVID-19 or in isolation would not be allowed to vote during the general election on the 11th of November, as it was against the law, and that expanding proxy voting for COVID-19 patients would not be possible. If you're COVID positive, he said, you are supposed to be in quarantine either at a government facility or at your own home. Likewise, in Singapore, citizens are under a quarantine order, have stay-at-home notices, or diagnosed with acute respiratory infection were not allowed to vote. They had left their home when they've been in breach with Singapore's Infectious Diseases Act. Similarly, in Taiwan, people under isolation or quarantine at home were prohibited from going and casting their votes, as this would go against the Taiwan Communicable Disease Control Act. In Chile, there are issues there too. In Croatia, actually, there were initially plans from the electoral management body to prevent citizens from voting, although it's led to a constitutional court case challenged the constitutionality of that issue. Fortunately, there are also many cases, however, where there are good news, and there are examples of resurgence or resilience in democracy, where electoral officials, managers have very quickly put in place new procedures in order to ensure that citizens can vote. And you can see this hopefully on the screen here. This ranges from postal voting to proxy voting to advanced voting and so on. So postal voting is one obvious mechanism, and I know the audience will be much more familiar with the case of South Korea where that was put in place, and Antonio will obviously speak more directly to that shortly. Yeah. Elsewhere in North Macedonia, people with COVID-19 under quarantine could cast their votes from home via mobile voting teams accompanied by a doctor wearing personal protective equipment. In Spain, in the regional elections in Galicia and Basque, voters with COVID-19 who were required to isolate could either postal vote or they could proxy vote, although they were forbidden from voting in person. And in New Zealand, voters in quarantine or isolation could vote by telephone, ahead of election day. In other cases, perhaps the polling processes have been adapted to ensure that citizens could vote who are infected through a particular pathway or were able to vote early. So there are many lessons of very quick adaptation to the situation. I guess the points that I'd like to kind of begin to kind of end on is thinking about what this leaves us in terms of the kind of so-called new normal, which is a phrase that we hear a lot about. One danger is that countries can introduce very rushed changes, that you're faced with an immediate crisis, an unexpected crisis like the pandemic, and so a country might very quickly want to put some of these processes in place. And it's very important that they do so where possible. But obviously there is also a danger here that citizens, the system, the administrative system, the financial system, that may not be able to deliver these processes particularly smoothly. We saw, for example, in one of our case studies of Poland, where there was an attempt to move to all postal voting for the presidential election, which there was insufficient administrative capacity to do so. This led to the eventual postponement of the election and a rethink of those systems. The stability of law is really important, and it's generally advised that changes to laws should not be introduced less than 6 months or perhaps even a year ahead of the election. And with COVID not likely to disappear, it's obviously therefore important for countries around the world to think very deeply about how they can proceed. Part of this is reviewing the accessibility requirements in general terms anyway, to make sure that everybody is given the opportunity to vote. Part of this is to ensure, so that might involve establishing other special mechanisms such as postal voting or proxy voting. But part of this is really thinking about assessing the potential risks. What if there is another pandemic? What if there is a flood? What if there is a problem such as a power cut near polling stations? What happens if there is a cyber attack? And all this leans to the importance of thinking about risk management, thinking into the future about what steps should be in place in order to ensure that democracy can be realized. And the crucial part of that, we think, is trying to enable lesson drawing across countries, and therefore we encourage you to look at some of the resources that many colleagues have contributed and produced. I'd like to thank you again for the invitation and for listening. I'm very happy to share the slides afterwards for people who are interested. Some publications available there, and I'll leave my email address there, which is t.s.james@uea.ac.uk. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. There is a round of applause here in Seoul. Not sure it's easy to hear, but thank you very much. So now we move on to the third presentation before coming on to our Q&A session. Our final speaker is Professor Jang Song-hoon, and he will give a presentation about the Korean cases of special voting. Professor Jang has previously lectured at 3 different universities in Korea, but he is currently professor of the Korean Civic Education Institute for Democracy, and he is in charge of research and lectures on elections, political systems, and civic education. He is here with us today, so please give him a round of applause as he comes onto the stage.
Good afternoon. I am the Professor Jang Song-hoon from Korean Civic Education Institute for Democracy of NEC. The COVID-19 pandemic is affecting all countries. It's making everybody suffer a lot. Despite that, election and democracy of the world should still be discussed, and we are having today's forum to do that. I'm so grateful for this opportunity, and I'm going to talk about special voting in Korea. The 2 speakers before me have mentioned great aspects of election, and we first need to think about the necessity of special voting? Well, before that, we need to first look into the history of voting. If you look at the history of democracy, it is in line with the expansion of the voting rights. So today, in all countries, we have voting rights guaranteed and systemized and generalized. But for us to reach this level, there were many efforts and sacrifices made. So in all democratic countries around the world, we have the suffrage, which is like a basic human right. And in the modern democracy, if we are to talk about the guarantee of suffrage as the precondition of democracy or indicator of democracy, well, that is not possible because it's too generalized. And it's the same for Korea. Well, suffrage is generalized and so common these days. So today what I'm going to talk about is not just about the suffrage that is provided based on the Constitution, but I will be talking about the quality of the voting rights guaranteed to the Korean population. Today we are having the 2020 Seoul International Forum on Election, and the theme is overcoming the pandemic toward democracy. And this session, the first session, is about various countries' election overcoming the limits. And I think that the session's theme and also the broad theme of the conference reflects the fact that we are not just talking about the basic rights of voting. We have to look beyond it. When we look into democracy, well, these days we don't need to discuss the voting rights for certain people like women or people of color or etc. So as long as people meet certain preconditions of different countries, they can get this voting right. So we can say that we have the legal guarantee of the voting right provided to the general public. However, some people have their legal voting rights, but in practical sense, some people might not be getting those rights. So as Professor James mentioned briefly, there are different methodologies that we can use for voting, and those methods should be developed in line to guarantee that practical right to the general public. So sometimes even when people have the legal voting rights, due to the time limitation or the space limitation, or due to other reasons, people are not able to exercise those rights. For example, as Professor James mentioned, there are some people who are very sick and they cannot go to the polling station. They will not be able to exercise the voting rights. Or I might be in some very faraway location, so I cannot go to the polling station. Or I might be on board in the middle of the ocean because of my job. Or I might be imprisoned. Those cases can exist. And maybe some people can be abroad to study or to work. In those cases, they have their legal voting rights guaranteed, but against their will, their voting rights can be limited due to time constraint or physical space constraint. So in those cases, they are unable to exercise the voting rights. So we can put it as the guarantee of the practical voting right. So today we are here to talk about the special voting systems in Korea, and that is to guarantee the actual practical voting rights that goes beyond just legally providing those rights. So in that framework, I will be looking into the special voting systems in Korea. These are the methodologies already used in many other countries as well. But in Korea, what is different from other countries is that we have some special characteristics in these special voting systems. Some of those special votings are a bit more advanced or differentiated from other countries. So if we understand this, I think we can achieve better development of the special voting. So in Korea, we have home voting, overseas voting, and ship voting, and early voting. Those are the systemized special votings guaranteed in Korea. And what is being discussed these days is the internet voting or the electronic voting. We are looking into those possibilities, but they are not yet implemented for the election of the public seats yet. So let's go into each one of them one by one. First is the home voting. For the home voting, it is where some people are not able to go to the polling station due to their physical difficulties to vote at their own home. So that is what we do with the home voting. In general, this home voting is done through the postal voting. So in advance, people need to register as home voting. Those are some restrictions we have. But even when we guarantee the practical voting right, we still need to think about the fairness or the guarantee of secrecy of the voting. So even when these people have the right to vote at their home, sometimes there might be some constraints in regards to whether they can exercise their actual will. So home voting has rather long history in Korea, and with the COVID-19 situation, home voting was still quite effectively utilized in this new situation. With the expansion of the COVID-19, there were some people self-quarantined at home, or those who are confirmed and being treated at certain facilities, well, they have the same physical disability to vote at the polling station. So in those cases, they can register as home voters in advance and use this system to vote through the postal system. So this is what we say as the basic level of practical voting rights guarantee. I have some pictures here. So on the left side, you can see the senile home, people there who are using the polling station there to cast their ballot. On the right side, you can see the ballot paper, how it is being sent to different addresses. So through this envelope, we can guarantee the secrecy of people's decision. Second method is the overseas voting. Overseas voting is provided to Korean citizens living abroad or visiting abroad. So even when they are not in Korea, they can get their voting rights guaranteed. It doesn't have a long history. Actually, in the past, for those living abroad, there was no clear method provided to those overseas citizens. But, well, we have not just the overseas citizens who are living as permanent residents in foreign countries, but also people who are just visiting those countries for a short time. So prohibiting them from voting due to their situation was found to be unconstitutional. So we have devised this new method of overseas voting. When it first started, these overseas citizens had to go to the Korean consulates or embassies in abroad to register as overseas voters. However, that is a big restriction. So we eliminated that. So in order to improve that restriction, we have tried to find easier ways for voters to register and also easier ways for voters to actually cast their ballot. In the past, people had to go to the Korean offices abroad, and that was time-consuming and also very expensive for them to travel. And we found the necessity to revamp it, so people now can register through online or through email, through mail, or sometimes there can be proxy registration. And regarding the voting location, in the past, there were very strict conditions for the installation of the polling stations. However, we have eased it so that we can have more polling stations installed in overseas locations. So those are two improvements made. So if you compare the voting turnout, it was about 45% at the beginning, but now we have more than 70% of overseas voting turnout, which shows that there were a lot of improvements. Third is the shipboard voting. So actually, this might be very interesting to some people who are from outside Korea. So due to occupation, some people have to be on board for a long time, maybe due to deep sea fishing and etc. And on the election date, if they are still working in the ship, well, they cannot vote. They couldn't vote in the past. So they have the basic right to vote as the citizen of Korea, but they couldn't exercise it because they were in the middle of the ocean. So they couldn't vote in the past. But to improve this, since 2012, we have introduced a shipboard voting. This also requires pre-registration. So if you have pre-registered, you can still vote on the board, on the ship. So some people might ask, how can people cast vote on the ship and how can the ballot be collected? And if people vote on board, can we guarantee the privacy or the secrecy of the vote? There were some questions regarding that. So first, regarding the fairness and the secrecy of the vote, on the ship, the captain of the ship is managing the election, and if there are any unfair actions taken during the election, we can take very severe punishment. And we also have some people oversee the process. Regarding technological procedures, well, this is what happens for the shipboard voting. So you can see that when the vote is casted, then we of course have to collect it back at the government office. What we do is the shield fax. It might be a new thing you hear. So shield fax is like an encrypted, enclosed fax sending. So even from overseas, if you put your ballot in this machine, then it will be all encrypted and everything is protected. So nobody would know which candidate you have chosen. So this is the sealed fax. And this is what the election office would be receiving on the other side. Last thing is the early voting. Early voting is quite common in many countries. You must be quite familiar with this. But in Korea, it has a big special characteristics. In the US, people do many early voting. And in Korea, what is special is that for early voting, you do not need to register that you are going to do the early voting. There is no need for that, and you can go anywhere in Korea, even outside your constituency, to cast the ballot. In other countries, what is common is that you can only go to the early voting stations within your constituency, but that is not the case in Korea. So to guarantee the convenience of voters, we have allowed this. And how can it be possible? How can anybody go to anywhere? First, what we have is the identifying machine. And in the identifying machine, we have a consolidated voters list. It is all encrypted and very secure. It is free from any possibility of hacking. And what we have is that the ballot paper is printed out on the spot after that person is identified. So that is how we have people do the early voting anywhere they want within Korea. So this is a lot of there. So these are some of the examples of how we have made improvements to guarantee the practical voting rights. Well, we still need a lot of more improvements in the future because, like in the case of COVID-19, things that we did not expect in the past can come up. And there might be new situations where we have difficulties in exercising the right to vote. So it's not just Korea, but many other countries, voting management, election management bodies, we need to work together to come up with better ideas and better ways to guarantee more voting rights to wider public. And during today's forum, I think we can have fruitful and meaningful discussions to come up with better ideas to enhance the voting rights to more people. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Professor. And we will now beginning our Q&A session. So if the Professor would like to stay and stay with me on the stage, we will open our question and answer. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Thank you very much for all the presentations. I think there was a lot for everybody to take away there. I'll start by asking one question we got in advance, and this is to all presenters, so maybe we'll go in the order you gave the presentation. There is a large number of early voting and special voting methods mentioned here. There was internet voting, also postal and other methods used in various countries, and then the 4 types in Korea. So with the current pandemic, is the idea of the traditional election day, is this now over? Is it outdated to say an election is a single day and we should maybe be talking about a period of time or rather than just sort of a single moment? Maybe Professor Krimmer, we can start with you.
Yeah. I mean, clearly the need to expand in time is very visible all across the world, right? So I mean, no matter where you look in the more elaborate democracies, whether that's Germany or you look in the United States or also in France, I mean, there are movements that include allowing voters to cast their ballot before election day using alternative means. So all under this umbrella of this convenience voting. Yeah. So there is certainly the trend. Nevertheless, if you ask people, and we see that in particular with young voters, what they consider to be the important civic duty, it is to appear on election day. So if they have the chance, I think people would prefer to vote on election day, but there are circumstances that actually hinder us from being able to do so. And that's why in order to maintain the voter turnout on a high level, we need to differentiate the electoral experience. Of course, there are voices that say, like, let's not open up the election day wider because we're losing the democratic tradition, the recognition that people get from it. And the easier we make, the lesser the value of the vote will be. But I think, you know, we need to respect today's developments, that we become a more mobile, a more global society. And with that, in order to enable the decision-making by as many people as possible, we need to offer alternative means to cast a ballot. It shouldn't be the standard way, but certainly as an exception, as an additional means, I think it's a very wise and a very useful addition. If that has to be 13 different channels like they are in Estonia, I'm not sure, but certainly something is useful to support the casting of votes.
Okay, thank you very much. And maybe the same question to Professor Toby James.
No, thank you. Luke, I would very much agree, I think, with Robert's comments there. I mean, I recently did some work trying to set out a bit of a framework thinking about how we evaluate elections. And I think one of the criteria that we should add in there is convenience. Just as we want all of our services, like whether it's banking or everything else, to be convenient, we expect why should our elections not be convenient? And therefore allowing mechanisms like postal voting, but also early voting, which we've not said quite so much about, but which is enormously popular right now in the United States ahead of the presidential election. I think it's the right thing to do. I think the other issue there is equality. It can be really important, providing these different approaches allows some of the inequalities to be removed. And although tradition is sometimes seen as a barrier, this is how we always did things. Why remove these processes? I think new traditions, can be made. And I think that the anchoring thing should be what actually improves the citizen experience and what actually improves the quality of democracy, rather than traditions, because they can actually get in the way of what is really, really important.
Okay, thank you very much. And maybe Professor Zhang, what would you say about election day maybe being outdated or over?
Well, voting on the voting date, whether that will be losing the meaning, to answer that first, I think voting date will still be quite meaningful. There are many debates on voting on days other than the actual voting day, because if you vote earlier, then you might lose some campaign activities of the candidates, and there might be new issues that can come up or some scandals that can come up during that time period. So there can be many debates on whether it is right to vote earlier than the actual voting date. However, as I have presented, it is very important for the nation to guarantee the voting right of its citizens. So that is why we have many alternative ways. If our citizens are not able to vote, not because of their will, but due to unescapable situations like their health or their location, well, the government should be coming up with ways to allow them to vote. That is why we need to work on this. And in that regard, in terms of the equal opportunity, and in that regard also in guaranteeing the voting right, we need to work on improving the systems and institutions. With the time, of course, we need to continuously work on the systems and institutions, but we do not know what will be the right answer. We have to look at the context and the situation and keep on improving on the situation and the system. But what we need to focus on is whether we can guarantee the fairness and secrecy of the vote. Those are the important focus points for us.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And we've actually not got much time, so I'll just go one last quick question. So if you could keep the answer fairly short. I know that's always difficult in this kind of forum, but my question would be about how would we build trust in these forms of special or early voting? I know Professor Krimmer mentioned some of this about building trust in internet voting. What is like the key for the election management bodies watching today to build trust in these special form of voting that voters are not used to? Professor Krimmer, maybe you can start.
Yeah, I mean, as always, when you build trust, you build it over time. Yeah, so you need to have positive experience, because trust essentially is that you do not expect negative things to happen. Yeah, I mean, that's what trust is. And therefore, trust is earned over a long time, but it's lost immediately. Yeah? So the only thing you can do is you can start small and grow bigger over time. You can either do that with smaller pilots, you can do that with regional pilots, or like in the Estonian model, you use a technology that's not immediately available. Yeah, so actually having the possibility of having people to learn a technology, and through that having a natural limiter that over time, because it grows, actually allows you to have a better understanding, a better usage, therefore. So positive experience, in short.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. And maybe Professor Toby would like to speak on that too.
Just two quick things to add. I think one is to try and build citizens into the process for actually designing these mechanisms. I mean, clearly, when you're looking at something like internet voting, they're not necessarily going to have all the knowledge and information for every detail, but actually including them into designing how what actually their concerns would be, listening to citizens, listening to other stakeholder groups, I think would be really important. Getting everyone on board as part of that process. And secondly, actively combating misinformation. So getting onto social media, looking at what's being said, and actually listening to that and responding proactively to those mechanisms. I don't think there's an issue with trust about early voting. I think there's consensus there. I can't see how early voting is a trust issue. So I think good support for that.
Okay, thank you very much. And lastly, Professor, would you like to speak about trust in the special voting?
I also share similar thoughts in managing elections. Well, gaining trust, actually, I think it has to do with the history of the country and also the culture of the country. So it's not easy because election, it always entails winners and losers. So we always have distrust or mistrust in each other. And during the election process, we always have those countries who had the election rigging. And if there are those cases, well, it's not easy to overcome the distrust. So what is very important is the transparency in the election process and the election system. We need to provide the transparency to all participants of the election, the managing bodies and also the voters. Also, whether to have the election or not itself, actually, I think the experience itself is very important. So we have some new voting methods. Well, those cannot be just enforced, but we have to accumulate experiences to give trust and confidence to people to try to use it. And also communication would be very important. We have to tell people why certain new methods are implemented and how those methods are being implemented. We have to guarantee those understanding and consensus amongst people. It's not just a legal issue or institutional issue. We have to work together with many people to just go step by step.
Okay. Thank you very much. And before we end, maybe is there any questions anyone would like to ask on the floor before we leave? We maybe have time for a quick question if there is one. But I don't think there is. So we will end the first session here. Thank you very much to everybody that participated. We're very grateful, especially to people in Europe who have got up very early to be part of it today. So thank you very, very much. We're going to have a 10-minute break before starting with our second session. So we look forward to having you back then when we will start at 4:40 Korea time or 7:40 a.m. GMT. Okay, thank you very much.
가도록 하겠습니다. 감사합니다.
hope you all enjoyed your break, and we will now be beginning our second session entitled Election Management Overcoming COVID-19 in Korea. The 21st National Assembly elections were held in April and were some of the first national elections after COVID-19 had spread around the world and been declared a pandemic. Experts from different fields will present on their views of the election, the key aspects of election management, and what other countries can take away from this example, with COVID-19 and the pandemic looking like it could last for some time yet. Our first speaker is Hong Yong-gun, Senior Policy Advisor at the NEC, and he will go over an overview of the special COVID measures used in Korea for these elections. Senior Advisor Hong is responsible for promoting and initiating major policies put forward by the NEC and related data collection, research and review, as well as internal and external opinion gathering. During the 21st National Assembly elections, he served as the Director of the Elections Division of the Sejong Special Governing City Election Commission, overseeing elections in that region. Please welcome him to the stage.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Hong Yong-gun. I am a senior policy advisor at the NEC, and during the 21st National Assembly elections, I served as the director of the election division of the Sejong Special Self-Governing City Election Commission, and I managed and oversaw the election in this region. So sharing Korea's election management experience with COVID would hopefully be a help to the countries that are preparing their elections. So I would like to talk about COVID-19 and the election environment and how we prepared for special response measures and election management during the COVID-19 crisis and evaluation of our measures. So this is the summary of the 21st National Assembly elections. The election was held on April 15th to elect 300 National Assembly members. There are 4 voting methods, which are election day voting, early voting for 2 days from 5 days before election day, home voting for the pre-registered voters with limitations in physical movement, and overseas voting by voters residing overseas. The number of eligible voters was about 43 million, and about 29 million cast their ballot. Turnout was 66%. 330,000 election staff were mobilized. Polling staff stood at 260,000, counting staff 64,000, and election officials 2,900. This is COVID-19 spread progresses in Korea before the election. First, a confirmed case was identified on January 20. Then the number of cases rapidly rose, and on February 23rd, infectious disease crisis alert was raised to severe. And as of March 10th, Korea showed the second highest number of cases in the world after China. And as of March 11th, 1 month before the election, WHO declared pandemic. COVID-19 pandemic began to affect the politics of countries around the world. The UK postponed the local elections of May for a year, and France, Russia, and US put off their elections. So about 50 countries around the world were deferring or canceling elections, and the number of such countries has increased to about 70. So let me briefly talk about Korea's political and social conditions back then. Political parties refrained from face-to-face election campaigning, such as speeches and handshaking, and they voluntarily implemented non-contact activities such as the internet and phone calls. And public anxiety was at the peak due to skyrocketing confirmed cases, and PPE supply was so unreliable that the Korean government implemented a public mask supply scheme. And many were concerned about the situation that voters would come out of their home and gather to cast their votes, and some insisted that election should be postponed. And against this backdrop, the NEC that was in charge of election management in Korea had many concerns. First, potentially low turnout if voters do not leave their home. And because of the limited campaigning, voters would have insufficient information on the election and candidates. In addition, infected voters or those in quarantine might fail to exercise their voting rights, and the voting may trigger nationwide COVID-19 upsurge. However, given that Korea was effectively controlling the spread of COVID-19 and the potential political and social confusion coming from delayed elections, the NEC decided to proceed with the elections as scheduled. And the NEC came up with meticulous measures to hold elections amid COVID-19, less than 2 months before the election date. The principle was disinfecting as much as possible is the best election management, and 3 responses were developed. First, creating a safer voting environment. Second, guaranteeing voting rights to the fullest. And third, closely cooperating with the related organizations. For effective response, NEC organizations at different levels divided roles for effective response. The NEC of Korea is composed of the central organization and 17 시도 and 249 구, 시, 군 organizations. The central organization focused on establishing response measures, disinfection plan and supply, and PR for voters. 시 and do organizations monitored infection status by region and supported subordinate 구, 시, and 군 organizations. 구, 시, and 군 organizations focused on staffing, disinfection in polling and counting locations, and emergency liaison with health institutions. So from the perspective of election management body, it was one of the most challenging conditions as complicated infection prevention work was added. And these are special response measures drawn up by phase. Following February 26 comprehensive response measures announcement, special measures to increase turnout were devised on March 12, and voting management measures were developed on March 20, and counting management measures were established on April 2nd. So this phased approach was to monitor the progresses along the timeline. And according to the comprehensive COVID-19 response measures, we provided video and other various forms of education for election staff, and PR activities were conducted in a non-contact manner, such as broadcasting, printed media, and online. And in case staff isolation or shutdown of the election management office, criteria for work adjustment and staffing support were applied. In Chungju Election Commission, all staff who were in contact with a journalist who contracted COVID-19 virus were isolated. So as per the plan, the upper-level organization, Chungcheong Provincial Election Commission, dispatched supporting staff. And required resources were secured and distributed in a rapid manner. To prepare for possible quarantine of polling and counting staff, we prepared reserve staff of about 10 to 20%. And we also secured additional resources for temperature check at polling and counting locations. And disinfection supplies were not reliable in provinces such as face masks, So those supplies needed at polling and counting stations were provided or procured in advance based on consultation between the NEC and Public Health Authority. And expenses of election management were rapidly funded through reserve budget. So now let me touch upon the policies to resolve COVID-19 related concerns. First, to address possible turnout decrease. Above all, to protect the voting environment from COVID-19, Code of Conduct for Voters and preventive rules were drawn up and promoted through media, including TV, and they were mailed to every household. And the voting environment was aired in real time, live streamed, so that voters could be reassured. And to guarantee voting rights of confirmed patients, they were additionally registered for home voting. They could use email, facsimile, or text messages in home voting. After the expiry of a home voting registration, if voters or medical staff contract the virus and go under isolation, they could cast their votes at special early voting stations installed at 8 residential care centers, where confirmed patients were gathered. And for those in self-quarantine at home, we came up with measures. For example, they were allowed to leave their home for voting purpose as approved by Public Health Authority, and they could cast their vote after official voting hours, which was after 6 p.m. And voters under self-quarantine could apply for special voting if they were asymptomatic. For example, no respiratory symptoms or fever. They could also use the polling station after 6 p.m. This is how Code of Conduct for Voters looks like, along with the preventive rules. They were mailed to every household, and they were affixed as posters on streets and entrance of polling stations, and they were released through media. Now let me move on to voting management. About 17,000 polling stations were operated. One day before election day and after voting, all polling stations were disinfected by specialized companies. Doorknobs, polling booths were inspected frequently, along with ventilation. And temperature check staff were located at the entrance of polling stations, and voters whose temperature was over 37.5 degrees Celsius and those who didn't wear masks cast their ballots at temporary booths. Hand sanitizers were placed, and all voters were given disposable vinyl gloves so that they could mark the ballot paper wearing them. And on the floor of the waiting space at polling station, there were markings to distance voters more than 1 meter apart. And voters were requested to refrain from speaking unnecessarily, and for identity check, they pulled down their face masks briefly. And those staff in charge of temporary or special polling booths, they were given special PPE, such as clothing, face shield on top of masks and surgical gloves. Now about special early voting stations. As these stations were for confirmed patients, recruiting staff was difficult. So the NEC directly secured the resources and provided level D PPE and supplies. Medical staff at residential care centers that house a group of confirmed patients voted at special early voting stations. And to separate their routes, medical staff cast their ballots first, and then patients voted. And staff accompanied each patient from isolation place to polling location so that contacts or wait time could be minimized. And envelopes containing ballot were disinfected and put in additional container to be sent out. And we also managed the overseas voting targeted at voters residing overseas. Overseas voting was supposed to be performed in 176 diplomatic missions in 117 countries, but situations varied depending on countries, so managing overseas voting was challenging. And due to movement restrictions in host countries, 91 diplomatic missions decided to suspend voting. And in the case of the 17 countries where it was difficult to deliver ballots back to Korea due to flight cancellations, counting was allowed at the missions, and the results were reported in an electronic manner. And overseas voters who returned to Korea could vote at a domestic polling stations if they registered themselves for returnee voting. Now, counting management. Counting in Korea is done at 구, 시, and 군 counting centers. Hundreds of staff stay in an indoor place for a long time, so such a setting was vulnerable to COVID-19 risk. The largest possible location was selected for counting, and the location was disinfected one day before counting and after counting by professional disinfection service providers. Disinfection mats were placed at entrance, and all staff's temperature was checked, and those with fever or without masks were prohibited from entering the place. An observation area was marked on the floor so that observers' rights were guaranteed while they kept a distance from each other, and those who did not wear masks had to leave. Counting staff were provided with masks, medical gloves, and face shields, and they were made to use hand sanitizers often. Health clinics and fire departments provided health personnel and emergency vehicles so that anyone who showed symptoms during counting could be addressed immediately. Supplies for disinfection were provided in a timely manner thanks to the reserve budget and cooperation with public health authority. The central NEC procured supplies and distributed to 시도, and then down to 구시군, and then down to individual polling stations. These are major disinfection supplies, and to distribute remaining supplies to schools, senior centers, or the vulnerable population afterwards. Remaining supplies were gathered and donated to public organizations or social groups. About the National Assembly elections, many evaluated election management positively. Major achievements include 0 infections associated with election and the highest turnout in 28 years, even amid the pandemic. And this was possible thanks to NEC's thorough preparations and guide, nationwide cooperation, and mature citizens who trusted the government and complied with preventive rules. However, there were limitations. For example, limited campaigning, lack of information on candidates, and varying countries in countries where overseas voting was performed. So, we believe that we need to come up with sophisticated measures to address a non-contact era of COVID-19. I think the case of Korea demonstrated that democratic rights can be upheld even amid COVID-19. However, managing elections amid epidemic spread is complicated because countries have different situations, contexts, election systems, and requirements. However, Korea's case can provide a good example and reflection point. And this is the common challenge the international society needs to handle together. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much for that presentation and summary of the NEC's election management policies. We will now move to look at the Korean case from a political science perspective with a presentation from Professor John Delury. He is at the Graduate School of International Studies at Yonsei University, where he serves as chair of the program in international cooperation and is an expert on East Asia. He wrote an opinion piece for the New York Times about the 21st National Assembly elections in Korea, entitled "How Democracy Won the World's First Coronavirus Election." Although he is actually living in Korea, today he joins us by video from his university in Seoul. So welcome, Professor.
Thank you.
How are you doing there in Seoul?
Yeah, just on the other side of town, doing very well. I'm glad you can hear me.
Okay, excellent. Well, I'll leave the stage to you, and please feel to take it away.
Great. Well, thank you, Luke, and hello to everyone. I'm sorry I can't be there in person, but I guess we're all connected virtually these days. And I'm delighted to join this conversation. I definitely feel humbled and outclassed by the company. And even Luke introduced me that I would provide a political science perspective, but I'm not even a political scientist. I'm a historian. But I think, what I would hope to add very modestly is some reflections as, I suppose, a kind of insider outsider, an informed observer who does think a lot about democracy and its meaning as a US citizen who's been living here in South Korea for 10 years. And so I'll try to kind of reflect a little bit. I don't have the technical expertise of others, but I will try to maybe offer some layman's observations of the election and its broader significance, because I was moved to write about it in the New York Times, as Luke mentioned. We just heard from Mr. Hong about the statistics, but I think even though it wasn't that long ago, it does take some work to remember that in February, March, the idea of holding an election in April was pretty scary to just a lot of people here. I would not have been surprised at all if that election had been postponed or canceled. We have to remember that South Korea was the first hotspot after China. And it really was, I remember getting phone calls from all my friends and family in the US wondering, are you guys okay? And will Seoul be okay? And so the idea that just a month later, when you get to March, and it's still quite bad by the standards of that time, that, South Korea would be bringing together what was close to 30 million people, or some fraction of that, indoors to vote. It was a brave decision, I think, to move forward with that. And there's a thin line sometimes between brave and stupid. We're all very lucky here in Korea that the government and the authorities, the commission, and the South Korean public were brave and committed to voting, and they turned out in huge numbers and record numbers for a midterm in recent times, but not stupid about it, very smart about it, very careful with hygiene, with preparation in all the ways that we've been hearing about, quite systematic in doing it really carefully. And the importance of that can't be understated. I think for Korea, but for liberal democracies in general, these are sort of hard times. This has been a hard year, and I think, historians of world politics are going to describe this period of history that we're living in as not democracy's finest moment, when liberal democracies are under a huge amount of strain for a variety of very complex reasons. Those strains are coming from within many of our societies and our economies, and they're also coming from without in terms of competition among different countries and different types of systems. And so on top of that, we have a pandemic, a kind of once in a century event. And so for South Korea to go through with that election and to show it could be done safely, and we have no evidence that there was any outbreak triggered by that gathering of tens of millions of people, really was an important statement for liberal democracies, that our way of organizing our politics can be done, even under conditions that in terms of public health really do come with some risk. Another observation, and I'd be curious to hear more of the experts talk about this. I think there was some discussion in the last panel. My understanding, and the people I knew, friends and family here who are South Korean citizens, voted in person. I think the majority was in-person voting. And there's a lot of attention to all the different ways in which voting could be done. But at the end of the day, again, to my understanding, was an in-person vote. And I think we shouldn't lose sight of that. Obviously, I'm watching November 3rd, we all are, and I will have some comments on that. But there is something to the traditional election, the election day, the in-person rite, R-I-T-E, the rite, the ritual of going to the poll and making your vote and making it count. Politics is theater. And in monarchies, you have the theater, all kinds of great theater of coronations. And in democracies, our theater, a big part of our theater, is election day. And I think we should be careful about parting with that too easily. The fact that we have all these technologies could actually be an argument to stick with a traditional approach, that this is a traditional part of our lives and our political systems. And if we can do it safely, psychologically, we may actually have more public trust if we stick with a method we've been using for hundreds of years of showing up in person and voting. And again, Korea proved that could be done even in adverse public health conditions. It reminds me a little bit, for the academics, of one of the great works on nationalism by Benedict Anderson about imagined communities. And he talks about the effect of the newspaper and reading the morning newspaper or the evening newspaper, and whether it's liberal or conservative, part of your sense of being part of a political community, a nation, is that everyone else is reading their daily newspaper and you're getting roughly the same kind of story of the day. So I think there's something, we've lost that with how we get our news and our information. We all live in different bubbles and echo chambers, and it contributes to a severe problem of atomization and increasingly a difficulty in even talking to one another because our basic fact sets diverge. They're dissimilar. So again, maybe I'm too old-fashioned, but I think it's important as a communal act in a liberal democracy that a public goes out together as a public as much as that's possible and safe, and is able to vote. I can't help but, as an American citizen, reflect a little bit on, in terms of the political history of democracy for 2020. I think you can frame that from April 15th to November 3rd. And we don't know what is going to happen on November 3rd. But the year started terribly in terms of our health and our economies and so many things. But thanks to Korea, we got one big victory for democracy at the beginning of the year. And now we have this big question mark coming up next week and the time following it. What will happen? I'm struck again as a lived observer. Koreans I knew were determined to get out there and vote in April. There was almost no question that they were going to do it, but they also had the public trust. They trusted the system. They trusted the public health officials who were telling them that it would be safe to vote. And so they were able to vote in such huge numbers. I'm actually encouraged so far, watching what's happening in the United States. The numbers for early voting are, some estimates are this is the highest turnout since 1908. And at the same time, for myself, and when I talk to family and friends across the country, there's a feeling of of fear and even some measure of dread in terms of the election and the results, and whether there will be a peaceful transition of power, questions that at least Americans of my generation have never really had to grapple with. I think you have to go back to previous generations where Americans did have those kinds of concerns. And I think given America's place as a leading democracy, as the oldest liberal democracy with a written constitution, we all obviously will be watching November 3rd, but there's more at stake than the question of who wins, between Joe Biden and Donald Trump and Democrats and Republicans. There is something more fundamental for us all who care about liberal democracy to be aware of and attuned to, just like I think there was more at stake in Korea's ability to hold the election in the spring. There's more at stake in terms of the United States' ability to pull off next week's election and a peaceful, stable, and trusted transfer of power. I guess the last thing I would say, I'm eager to listen to Antonio and the conversation, but I do wonder if, in all these discussions we're having about the pandemic and Corona and how it's affecting various aspects of our lives, and today's discussion is about elections and electoral democracy, we do, I think, want to look beyond, even the most pessimistic epidemiologist will, I think, tell you this is going to go away eventually. This is not a permanent new normal. It could be a long time, but this too shall pass. And what do we learn out of this experience, and how do we come out of the experience better? So there are technical measures that we can take in terms of just basic public health and hygiene. But I do think there are more fundamental questions about how we organize our democratic societies. And again, for me, one of the lessons is, because we're socially distant and atomized and doing all this like on the computer, to me, this experience reaffirms almost the sacred act as a public of voting together. And that is something that I suppose I would encourage us all to part with not easily, and to think hard before we use technology to solve this problem. That maybe this isn't a problem we need technology to solve, that actually we want to maintain that tradition. And the second one, and I'll close on this, is the World Health Organization and the United Nations have drawn attention to not just the pandemic, but the infodemic. And that's something that certainly there's a constant, huge conversation about that in the United States. There's been conversations about that in Korea as well. And so this brings together the technological aspects and all the issues of public trust in the safety of the election, that one's personal health won't be compromised by voting, obviously is the most fundamental. But also, I think in this process, we need to think about what more can we be doing as democratic societies so that our public has basic trust in the information that they're getting about their politics going into the election. And that also has to do with the security, the transparency, the trustworthiness of the voting process, of the results. And I suppose the last thing I would say, and again, very much with November 3rd in mind, is, and maybe ask you guys, the technical experts, from my vantage point, we want to preserve the election day, but we don't need to be in a rush to get the results. And maybe that's a compromise where we allow early voting, as necessary, as useful, but we still encourage the communal act of election day. And then we counter kind of another trend of our times and of our technology, and slow down and say it's okay, we don't have to find out instantaneously the results. There's plenty of time to count the ballots carefully and transparently. And it seems like that slowing down is something that could build greater public trust. At least that's my feeling as a very worried American 1 week away from the 2020 presidential election, and a grateful resident here of South Korea. So let me close with that, and thank you again for inviting me to participate in this discussion.
Okay, thank you very, very much for that, Professor. That was definitely enjoyable to go from a different perspective outside of election management that we've had today. And now our final presentation of the forum, the last but certainly not the least, will be from Antonio Spinelli, Senior Advisor on Election Process and Political Participation and Representation at International IDEA. He has a distinguished career working with a number of international organizations. Recently has been working on studying elections undertaken during the pandemic, including the Korean case, and he has been looking at other special voting measures as well. He is joining us from Canberra in Australia. Welcome, Antonio. Can you hear us?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, you're sounding very clear. And I think you were the first to join us today, but the last to present. So thank you for waiting all this time.
It was a pleasure. It was a pleasure. Good afternoon, everyone. And I would like to begin by extending my personal thanks, and also on behalf of International IDEA, to the NEC for the invitation, but mostly also for the privilege to be part of this forum. And I also had a prior privilege to this, and that was that one of examining the National Assembly elections of the Republic of Korea, but albeit from afar. So in my presentation, I will cover challenges and opportunities in the management of elections under COVID-19, and we'll go to describe the difficult circumstances under which Korea elections had to be held, and also what key factors contributed, in my view, to their successful outcome, to conclude by emphasizing the legacies of these elections and what opportunities are stemming from this experience. So 8 months have passed since the World Health Organization declared COVID a global pandemic. And dealing with this crisis has implied stringent limitations to our participation in public events and gatherings, in which in turn, this ended up also challenging the fulfillment of our civic responsibilities and political rights. And so it was no surprise that elections, because of their participatory requirements, were an immediate casualty of the pandemics. Harmless when held in normal conditions, under a pandemic, elections pose instead serious threats to public health. And by now, these threats are known. But we also know that they are stemming from the fact that across the world, present time elections are still predominantly and rigidly, in some cases, conducted through traditional voting methods. By traditional voting methods, I refer to the method of voting in person at one polling station in the constituency of registration and on election day. So this voting method revolves on 3 main dimensions. A physical dimension. This voting method requires the physical attendance and the personal interaction of all those participating in it. Voters, poll workers, party representatives, and election observers alike. A spatial dimension. Traditional voting unfolds through administrative and procedural processes that are happening at a specific location, the polling stations. And finally, a temporal dimension. So voting is bound to occur during a prescribed limited time on election day. So in a pandemic, the requirement for the entire electorate of a nation to physically converge, the ritual that John was mentioning before, over a single day in confined and crowded spaces where maintaining a safe distance from others may be difficult, suddenly this presented risks for individual and public health. So these risks presented by the physical, spatial, and temporal dimension of traditional voting immediately made new and pressing demands on the management of elections. In a very short time, the pandemic has challenged long consolidated standards for the conduct of democratic elections and has rapidly transformed the way in which elections are planned and implemented, and also how their integrity can be assessed. And because of these challenges, numerous countries immediately faced the dilemma as to whether to hold or postpone their scheduled elections. This was the case, particularly at the initial outbreak of the pandemic, where no prior experience existed on how elections could be managed under such unprecedented circumstances. So at that time, no one knew as to whether holding an election under a pandemic was a feasible task at all, and what mitigating actions could help reducing risks posed to public health, and how effective these actions would be, and whether to which extent restrictions would limit the transparency, the accessibility, the inclusiveness, and the integrity of an electoral process. And finally, a very important point was the unknown was how to ensure sufficient voter participation that in turn could guarantee a resulting representative institution. So at the time, there were more assumptions than facts and more unknowns than certainties. So the first months of the pandemic were dominated by postponed elections. And it was against these difficult circumstances that the Republic of Korea had to hold these 21st National Assembly elections. And so the NEC had to take immediate measures to minimize health risk for voters, but also to reassure and mostly to convince them of its ability to guarantee safe voting conditions, so to ensure their undeterred participation. And these measures are well known and have been sufficiently described in detail by previous presenters, so I won't go into details, but thanks to these measures, and despite the risks involved in voting, the National Assembly elections unfolded efficiently, safely, and with the participation of more than 29 million voters, marking the highest turnout in almost 3 decades. So what I saw as the main accomplishment of Korea elections were their seamless and safe management and the resulting high levels of participation. So when assessing this achievement, it is important to point out what key factors contributed to make it happen. First, there was an effective capacity to contain the pandemic. So for an election to be held under such conditions, the outbreak must be at contained levels, or at least be contained by the time the election is held. There was a solid electoral framework. Early voting and mail voting methods were already part of Korea electoral framework. So they neither had to be devised anew, nor to be implemented under time pressure and with numerous unknowns. Importantly, there was a well-established, experienced electoral management body, broadly trusted, with proven capacity to ensure that elections could effectively and timely conducted under such constraints. There was timely availability of adequate means and resources that were necessary to guarantee the safe voting environment I was mentioning before, nationwide and in a very short time. And a very important ingredient was the strong sense of civic duty of Korean citizens. The crisis, rather than keeping them away from the polling stations, created a sense of national unity that led to their high voter participation rates. There was a conducive political environment that allowed political parties, while still competing in the elections, to put aside ideological differences and their entrenched positions and compromise and cooperate. There was multilateral cooperation, consultation, and coordination among the NEC and various ministries, their departments, and specialized agencies. And finally, there was also a strong, clear communication strategy to promote the adopted measures well in advance of the elections. And so the fact that on election day, voters already knew what to do and mostly what not to do helped reducing the time they had to spend in the polling stations and also minimize their exposure to the virus. What are the main legacies of these elections? I think, as the first country venturing into uncharted territory, Korea elections have offered and also continue to offer today much to learn. This experience has inspired and guided other countries that had to proceed. Also, they are about to proceed with their scheduled elections under the pandemic. And Korea's elections have shown to the world what conditions, measures, equipment, and behaviors must be in place to deliver a safe, technically sound, and participatory elections under the pandemic. Very importantly, the first-hand knowledge and understanding acquired through this experience have set a model and benchmarks which could be used by others to aim for. And also they have helped other countries to learn, adapt, and build resilience in their management of the elections. So by paving the way for other elections to be held, Korea's experience has also contributed to a shift in the initial trend to postpone elections that characterized the first months of the pandemic. And so today we can see a clear new tendency globally towards holding elections, still under the risk mitigating measures initiated by Korea. And thanks to these measures, we can see also another tendency. Some elections that have been held under the pandemic recently are now experiencing higher turnout rates than in previous election cycles, as this was Korea's case. But perhaps what I can see, and this I will connect to John's concluding remarks, what I can see about the most important legacy of the elections is that of having demonstrated the need to provide different voting methods, alternative to traditional in-person voting, that is compelling voters to physically attend one and one only polling station and 1/1 and one only day. So at International IDEA, we defined voting methods alternative to traditional voting as special voting arrangements. And unlike other countries, I mean, Korea had many disadvantages. You know, they want to be the first country to implement national election without prior knowledge was a big disadvantage. But also Korea had a great advantage compared to other countries. When it was hit by the pandemic, Korea had already several special voting arrangements in place, previously used and extensively tested and trusted. This method could also be rapidly and suitably expanded in response to the crisis. So Korea elections have demonstrated how special voting arrangements as alternatives, not as to replace traditional voting, constitute a measure offering voters not only safer, but also more convenient manners to cast a ballot. To cast a ballot either by voting in person, but during an earlier and longer period on election day, with fewer people and then fewer possibility of getting infected, so removing the temporal threat of traditional voting, or by voting remotely through early postal or mobile voting, away from the polling stations, from a safer place, removing all threats, physical, spatial, and temporal. Finally, what opportunities I see as stemming from this experience? So by forcing voting methods and practices globally from their prolonged, what I see a prolonged stillness, the pandemic is also prompting them to evolve. So we could see through the course of history as democracy gradually became more and more inclusive, participatory, and representative, voting methods had to respond, to adapt, to meet the specific demands of new social, political, economic, and demographic realities that were coming to the fore. And so after several centuries of evolving practices, present-time elections in many countries still remain, by and large, statically and conventionally centered on traditional methods that are still grounded on physical, spatial, and temporal requirements that by now, I'm afraid to say, they appear not to be longer capable to meet today's changing needs and mostly increased mobility. Often, traditional voting is the only available method offered to people to vote, excluding from the electoral franchise those who, for any reason, are unable to meet any of these three requirements. It is true that some countries do currently provide some forms of special voting arrangements, but for the most, they only are reserved for a privileged few, like government employees, military personnel, or voters abroad. And so while democracy and electoral enfranchisement needs are dynamically evolving through the passage of time, voting methods somehow appear to be instead lagging behind. The impact of COVID-19 on electoral management and the legacies from Korea elections reveal a disjuncture between the dynamic evolution of today's globalized world and the stillness of traditional voting methods. So while recognize then that the further voting moves away from the control environment of the polling stations, the greater the risk that remote voting poses to election integrity. Recognizing that special voting arrangements require security measures to be bolstered to detect and deter irregularities and fraud, and that such methods are costly and need to be introduced with time and be sustained in the long run, and that they need political consensus that is hard to obtain. And while recognizing that they require adequate legal frameworks, adequate infrastructures and capacities, we also need to acknowledge the opportunity that the pandemic is providing to rethink electoral accessibility. Not all countries have the infrastructure, the means, the resources, the capability, or even the desire to introduce, manage, and maintain special voting arrangements. But it is through political will, through appropriate and sustainable solutions that are drawn from own experience, but also from that of others, such as Korea's, electoral frameworks can be gradually strengthened and improved for election to become not only safer, but also more convenient and inclusive. So in closing, in addition to forcing us to take stock of its multiple challenges and restrictions, the pandemic has also brought a long and overdue realization that to further strengthen and safeguard our democracies, we need to make our elections truly inclusive, participatory, and representative processes. And I would like to close with a statement: is that I'm not suggesting to dismiss traditional voting entirely, but to complement with as many alternative voting methods as possible, because it's a requirement of the today's the world is mobile, so there are many people. For instance, I also believe in the ritual of voting at the polling station, of the nation coming together and converging at the polling stations, armed with a ballot paper, to express their say. And I would choose this method if I had several options. I would choose certainly this method rather than voting from my phone or from a shopping mall. But if the alternative is to be disenfranchised because as a migrant in Australia, I cannot vote in my Italian elections, then I would choose any voting method. that is made available to me to vote. And with this, I will close, and I want to thank you everyone for the attention, and also the NEC for the invitation again.
Thank you very much, Antonio. Thank you for the interesting presentation at the end of the day. And now we're going to move to a Q&A session. I'd like to invite Professor Hong Senior Advisor Hong to come back to the stage, and we will go through our Q&A session. Okay, so we only have about 15 minutes left, so we don't have a long time. So I have a couple of questions, and then I will open it up to the floor for some questions after that. So my first one is actually touching on something that Professor Delury said, which is eventually this pandemic is going to be over. Eventually, at some point, this is going to pass. But what parts of the Korean election that we took part during the Corona time, what parts do you think will be left? What parts do we think will continue? For example, in the election, we talked about more early voting, more different voting methods. Also, there was more campaigning online instead of face-to-face. Do we think any of these parts that came in during COVID will continue even after COVID has finished and gone away? So maybe I will go in the same order as the presentation. So I will invite Mr. Hong to speak first.
The special voting methods will persist after COVID-19. Of course, those special measures were drawn up to respond to the special circumstances of COVID-19. However, we dispelled concerns. For example, how can we encourage people to leave their home and visit the polling stations? Actually, that concern always existed even before COVID-19. So special measures will persist even after the COVID-19.
Thank you very much. Maybe Professor Delury, would you like to add anything to that part?
Sure. I mean, I don't know specifically on the Korean practices, but I think, you know, it was really interesting listening to Antonio. And actually, it's one of those moments where you say, gosh, your fellow panelist has a really good point. And I think you can reconcile some of the points I was trying to make with the points he was trying to make, in the sense that, you know, I'm a migrant too, and let me tell you how hard it is to vote right now in the U.S. election. And I do feel at some level disenfranchised, not actively, but just it's so impractical and expensive and difficult. And that's just a minor example. Again, in the United States, there's pretty active efforts at disenfranchisement. There's not a national holiday, as I think in Australia and here in Korea. So that time is assured or better enabled for working people. Here in Korea, I think Mr. Hong may have been alluding to, there's always a lot of questions about how late the polls stay open, because that will affect certain demographics. Younger voters will vote if they can late at night, you know? And so all that sensitivity. So I just want to kind of affirm, I guess, as a principle, that, as Antonio said, inclusivity and enfranchisement should be the starting point. And we have learned a lot. Korea's learned, and other countries are learning in adapting to this risk, how to make it more convenient. And so that multiplicity of means to vote, I didn't want to, I think I went too far to discount that. I still think that there's something to performing the act, you know, the communal right of the vote, but it doesn't mean every single one of us has to do it. If it's theater, and so if we can see others performing it and we know that it's happening, then as citizens, we feel part of that community. Again, I talked about Benedict Anderson, and his point is it's an imagined community. So what I would just stress is that we don't lose that theater and that imagination, that we do it together. And let me just say quickly, Luke, that I talked to my sister, and now there's ballot drop-in boxes in states in the United States. And, she wasn't even sure if it existed before, but now people are using them because of COVID, but there were others who were doing it at the same time. So it was early voting. It's a special voting arrangement that made it safe and more convenient, but there was still a sense of the community voting together, just because in the physicality and temporality, that time and place, others were doing it. So I think we can do both, and we can learn a lot and maintain a lot of these practices. But again, we shouldn't throw out that traditional right. And I think Antonio probably agrees with me, but I'll leave it to him.
Totally. I'm a traditional voter while advocating for alternative voting methods for inclusion.
And would you like to add anything, Antonio, on?
Yes, I would like to add. Not only I agree with John, but I think that elections, not only Korea's elections, but several elections have been held so far. I think 73 so far. I think since the COVID outbreak started, have created a precedent that would be maybe hard to roll back, but there will be important lessons that remain for us beyond 2020 or 2021, hopefully. I mean, depending when the pandemic will cease. But beyond, we should remember that the pandemic was a wake-up call. So beyond this crisis, there are many other crises. There could be malicious interference, natural disasters, terrorist threats, but even apathy. And so the positive trend that we had with this election, that the pandemic has provided an increased understanding of the need of a periodic and systematic review of the rules that govern the organization of an election, to be prepared for the unexpected. This crisis was majorly unexpected. And so, but there is also an important consideration to make between making the process more convenient. There is a tension basically between convenience and integrity. By having a process more inclusive, and by introducing new methods or expanding existing methods to expand, to reach more, to expand the enfranchisement of voters, integrity may be compromised. So, there needs to be a trade-off between, methods, need to be either to be in place or trusted, but, or if introduced anew, they need to be, political consensus. What Robert mentioned in the previous section, there needs to be resource, there needs to be time, there needs to be political will. There's so many things that cannot be done safely. I repeat, Korea had a very, very big advantage. And, I believe that what Korea has put in place will maybe continue to stay, but hopefully the traditional voting at the police station will not be touched.
Yes, thank you very much. I do have another question, but first, maybe I would like to offer up to the floor if there's any questions amongst our audience, maybe who would like to ask first before I go back to online. Is there any question? Well, if not, then I will stick to the question I have here, which is some people are asking, the number of cases in Korea was actually relatively low compared to countries that are holding elections now or plan to hold elections. So do you think that the election processes used in Korea would still be relevant if there are more cases of coronavirus in another country? Which parts are still relevant even if the corona cases are higher? Maybe you would like to start?
Yes. In March, Korea had the second largest confirmed cases following China. However, it dropped to about 100 right before election. Think about it. If there is an upsurge, people are really concerned about it, even when it drops a little bit afterwards. On the day of election, the daily infection number was about 2 dozen, so it was really low. So I think special measures were not really necessary because if you think about the daily number was only 20. However, we implemented the special measures to dispel people's anxiety and concern. We provided masks, surgical masks, and protective clothing, and all the safeguards and precautions. And if electoral management bodies can prepare those safeguards, I think they're applicable to other countries as well.
Maybe I'd like to extend that question quite differently to Professor Delury. Maybe, do you think there's a point where the public health and the need for democracy kind of clashes, where maybe there is too big a risk in public health that democracy, maybe we should suspend it? Or do you think that we should try, like Korea, and carry on sort of despite the risks? Or do you think there's kind of a limit there?
Well, it's a great question, the original one, and your supplement. I kind of defer to Antonio, who looks more systematically at the many cases and when some of those decisions were made. I mean, again, kind of being here for Korea and also watching the US election, actually in preparing for this, I just did my own, back of the napkin calculation, and given the rolling 7-day averages in the United States, I think you could have 1 million COVID positive cases who are voting. That's just based on, the number is in the high 60,000s of new cases per day. It's hard for us in South Korea to comprehend the kind of numbers that are happening in the United States. But it doesn't seem to be slowing down turnout. I think the psychological, obviously, there are a lot of things going on in the United States right now, but I think what Antonio was mentioning, that a trend that he's seen that did kind of start here, I think we're seeing in the United States as well, that the public health crisis is if anything just encouraging. I mean, people feel in the United States that is absolutely essential. It's like getting your groceries right now to go out and vote. It's an essential act, an essential worker, at the polling stations, and people are really voting. I mean, honestly, we haven't really gotten into federalism here. It's all nicely centralized. That also makes it more convenient because you could be at different parts of Korea. You don't have to be in your GU, I don't think, and you could still have voted. Whereas it's so fragmented and localized in the United States. But I think there are going to be states, certainly, where there's going to be outbreaks from the voting. I mean, they're just not putting in procedures, but I think a lot of COVID positive people are going to go to the polls. And so depending on how much understanding of that and reporting on that, will there then retrospectively be a debate? Gosh, did we put the health of our democracy ahead of the health of our bodies? I could see that debate occurring in the United States. But I have to say, I mean, you'd never wish ill health and spreading the disease. But it's we have to find a way to hold our elections under these conditions. We simply have to, is my view as a liberal Democrat.
Yeah, I think many people in the election field would agree. And maybe, Antonio, we've got a little bit of time left. Maybe you'd like to add something to that question before we close?
I will touch upon both questions. So I think that first of all, not all countries have the factors that I mentioned before in place, as Korea had, the ability to contain the pandemic, the trusted electoral management body, the electoral framework. So it's difficult to generalize. But when deciding to hold an election under a pandemic, I think there are several key influencing factors that need to be taken into account. The first is the type of election. that has to be conducted or postponed, and also whether there are legal provisions in the electoral framework that allow for a postponement, and then whether the electoral legal and procedural frameworks in place can respond suitably to the extraordinary requirements that are stemming from the emergency. And also what is important is to not only assess the pandemic infection rate at the time of the decision, but also the expected one at the time of the election. And also to determine whether there is broad agreement and support among electoral stakeholders for a postponement or not. And what conditions are favorable for introducing, what are the conditions? If the conditions are favorable for introducing, if absent, special voting arrangements, or for expanding them if present. And I would say also the timing of the elections and how soon they are scheduled, the reputation of the electoral management body, and what will be the implications of holding the elections under a pandemic, and what, last but not least, what the expected voter participation rate will be should the decision to proceed with elections be held. We don't want a case like the municipal elections in France, that they had a very lower turnout that put the representativity of the municipal councils at stake.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. That was a very interesting session, which we will close here. So thank you very much for joining us online and both in person. And we'll have a round of applause for our participants. Thank you very much, and see you again.
Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you.
Thank you, John, for the exchange.
Thanks, Sensei.
So thank you very much to all the presenters and members of our audience and everyone who was watching online. We hope you all enjoyed this forum and have found it informative and useful. We look forward to working with our partners in the future, and we wish you all the best of health. Thank you very much.